Hello, class. We're ready now to begin our discussion. Having looked at the problem of sin, we're ready to look at the work of redemption in Christ. We're going to begin with the discussion of the person of Christ. And this begins with the discussion of his deity, the deity of Christ. What is the biblical teaching on the deity of Christ? Well, what does Jesus say about himself? What are his claims about himself? He claims divine possessions in Matthew and in Luke. He claims divine prerogatives in Mark, in Matthew, and in John. He claims divine authority in Mark and Matthew. He claims a divine relationship with the Father in John. The claims made against him at his trial related to his claim to deity. He accepted the title of God in John 20:28 when Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." He uses unique titles, Son of God, with regard to himself. In the Gospel of John, the prologue points to his deity. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father. And then in verse 18, the only begotten God has made him known. So we have these things. And also in John's Gospel, we have a series of I am statements. And these are clear echoes of Moses in the burning bush, the most prominent of which is John 8:58, when Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." And the Jews sought to stone him because they knew very clearly what he was saying. He was claiming to be the one who appeared to Moses in the burning bush. The book of Hebrews clearly sets forth the deity of Christ in numerous places. Paul speaks of Jesus as the image of the invisible God in Colossians and the judge of all things. And Philippians 2:5-11 is of primary importance in this matter because Paul discusses here the deity of Christ in relation to his humanity. The term Lord is a key indicator. The Septuagint translation of the Old Testament used the Greek word kurios, which we translate as Lord, as a name for God. The Old Testament text applied to Jesus as Lord include Acts 2:20 and 21, Romans 10:13, 1 Peter 3:15. The New Testament use of kurios to designate God as Father and Sovereign occurs in numerous places. And there are passages where it is unclear if it refers to the Father or to Jesus. The evidence of the resurrection also tells a story. Pannenberg makes an argument. He argues that all of history is revelation, and the meaning of an event in relation to the persons whose history it intersects is important. To the Jews of Jesus' day, the resurrection would signify his deity. That's what it would mean to them. The origins of Christianity are traced to the resurrection. The early witnesses to Jesus were witnesses to the empty tomb in Jerusalem. And there is a clear lack of early Jewish claims that the tomb was not empty. And so these all point to supportive teachings for the deity of Christ. Now, what are historical departures from belief in the full deity of Christ? Well, very early in the history of the church, there was a movement known as Ebionism. These were Jewish Christians who denied the real deity of Jesus. Jesus was an ordinary person possessed of extraordinary powers. This group rejected the virgin birth. They held to an adoptionist Christology where the Christ Spirit came upon Jesus at his baptism and withdrew from him near the end of Jesus' life. There's Arianism, and don't mistake that with the wrong kind of Arianism. This is Arianism is spelled this way, and your spell checker won't know what that is, but it's named after an Egyptian presbyter named Arius. Okay, so let's make sure that's clear. Arius was a presbyter in Alexandria, Egypt. He argued that there was when the Logos was not. He was condemned in 318 in a regional synod in Alexandria and in 325 at the First Council of Nicaea and other councils afterward. Modern Arianism lives today in the Jehovah's Witnesses. The fundamental teachings is that only the Father is truly God, uncreated and eternal. The Logos is the first of God's created beings and is a perfect creature. The Arian proof text included John 14:28 and Mark 13:32. There was a group known as Semi-Arians that stressed the similarity of the Son to the Father, but not the essential oneness. Responses to Arianism involve a look at the passages implying the deity of Christ and a careful exegesis of the text used by Arians to support their position. So these are early deviations from the full deity of Christ. Today, a lot is done with what we call functional Christology. This is a modern development that seeks to avoid the ontological question about the nature of Christ and focuses instead on what Christ did instead of who he was. And it fails to recognize that what he did is directly tied to who he is. He could not have done the things he did if he is not who he says he is. So what are the implications for the deity of Christ? First, we can have real knowledge of God. John 14:9. Redemption, secondly, is available to us because Christ, as both God and man, achieved infinite merit in his atoning work. Third, God and humanity are reconciled in Christ. And fourthly, the worship of Christ, which we see portrayed in the book of Revelation and in other places, is entirely appropriate. So, that's the deity of Christ. Now let's talk about the humanity of Christ. It's not simply enough that he was fully divine. He must also be fully human. So what is the importance of the humanity of Christ? Well, first of all, by becoming fully human, he bridges the gap between God and man. There is an ontological gap, as we've already noted, between God and man. God is creator and eternally so, and man is created. Christ, by embracing our humanity, bridges that ontological gap. And then there is the spiritual and the moral gap. We are fallen and Christ is not, and we need atonement, and only a perfect sacrifice can provide that atonement. And so Christ, in his atonement, does more than just die on the cross. He continues that atoning work in his work as our intercessor, pleading our case before the Father, as we're told in Hebrews 4:12. So what is the biblical evidence? Well, we have evidence for his physical human nature. He was born. He was born just like anybody else is born. He was conceived in the womb of the Virgin Mary, and he grew in Mary's womb to maturation and was born. We see his growth and development and physical limitations as a human being, as a boy. We see his suffering and his death, especially in John 19:34, where his side is pierced with the spear and the blood and the water flow out. We see references to Jesus as a man throughout the New Testament. We see a psychological human nature at work in Jesus. He has human emotions. He weeps at Lazarus' tomb. He has uniquely human responses. He gets hungry. He gets tired. He demonstrates intellectual qualities. He carries out a religious life of worship in the synagogues. And we have the emphasis on the reality of his resurrection body. That he says, see and touch me, that I have flesh and bones, and spirit doesn't have flesh and bones. And so we see the reality of his resurrection body. So what were some early heresies related to the humanity of Jesus? Well, one was Docetism. Docetism took several forms. It means to appear human. This is a Gnostic belief that diminishes and devalues the physical world. And it's also akin to Marcionism. In both of these views, Christ was not truly human, but seemed to appear human. We have Apollinarianism, and it brings the problem of preserving the unity of Christ. In John 1:14, under the Apollinarian system, the flesh refers to the humanity of Christ, and so all that was human about Christ was his physical body. The Logos assumed the role of the human soul, and so there's no human will in Jesus. This view was condemned at the Council of Constantinople in 381. So what about the virgin birth? Is the virgin birth essential or non-essential? Well, the biblical evidence teaches a virgin birth. The Septuagint translates the Hebrew word in Isaiah 7:14. The Septuagint translates it with a Greek word that can only mean virgin. And in Luke 1:34, Luke says that Mary did not yet know a man, and the idea here is to know in the sense of having had sexual relations with a man. What is the theological significance then? Is the virgin birth necessary to the incarnation? I would argue that yes, it is, because without it, we would have a sinful human being. The virgin birth interrupts the cycle of the passage of original sin in the life of Jesus. And so it is necessary to his sinlessness. And it is necessary to the evidence of the reality of the incarnation. It is a reminder that our salvation is a supernatural event, that our salvation is wholly a work of grace. It is an evidence of the uniqueness of Jesus and of the power and sovereignty of God over nature. And so this brings us to a discussion of the sinlessness of Jesus. We have biblical affirmations of Jesus' sinfulness throughout the New Testament. But this raises a question: if he's fully human, could Jesus have sinned? James 1:13 makes this an interesting question because it talks about how God cannot sin. And so could Jesus have sinned? And if not, were the temptations he faced real temptations? These are questions that theologians have tried to answer for 2,000 years. Erickson argues that the temptations were real, but the outcome was always certain. Resisting temptation requires going more to the heart of temptation than submitting. And this raises the question of the relationship between sin and what it means to be human. For you see, Jesus is most truly human and perfectly human because he is sinless. To be human is not necessarily to err. To be fallen human is to err. Perfected humanity is meant to be sinless. So what are the implications of the humanity of Jesus? The atoning death of Christ has real merit because a real, sinless human substitute died for us in our place. Jesus can truly sympathize with us and intercede for us because he knows what we've been through. Jesus shows us what true humanity is supposed to be like. Jesus, therefore, is also not just our atonement, but our example. It reminds us that human nature fundamentally is good, although it has been corrupted by sin, and that God is not so transcendent that he is completely removed from his creation.